Hi. I'm going to venture into what I think is one of the more difficult chapters in the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi chapter 20, which is the equivalent in our Old Testament of Isaiah 48. I'll just give you some of my thinking about it. Again, this is not meant to be the last word on the subject, of course. It's just a way to read it. Now, I do draw my reading, though, from careful attention to the context, and I think that's important. And of course, I've tried to understand it in the context of chapter 19's material and the previous material, the introductory material in 19 moving into 20, as well as I've taken into consideration Nephi's commentary in chapter 22 on when he begins to expound Isaiah's chapters that he's reading to his brothers in these two chapters here. For this video, I'll see what I have time for, but I wanted to say a few things about Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet in Judah. His ministry spans about 40 years, going from 701 BC, 740 BC to 701 BC, so about 40 years. He was a statesman and a prophet that had access to the court. He worked with Hezekiah and others. He was trained. He was intelligent. He was political. He was a unique prophet in many ways, and it didn't come from the fields of sheep or something, like other prophets did, called from among the sheep or something. He was different, and he was more aristocratic. I don't know what word to exactly use, but he is the most quoted prophet in the standard works. His words have been touted by nearly everyone. Nephi delighted in Isaiah. Jacob delights in Isaiah. Moroni, Jesus Christ himself, says, "Great are his words." So now I wanted just to say a few things about the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. Again, this would have been on the brass plates for the Nephites. The book can be divided in two. The first 40 chapters, chapter 2 through about chapter 40 or chapter 39 is the first section. Chapter 40 is kind of a new beginning. In chapter 40, it runs through. It's debated exactly how far that runs, but there are about 55 chapters in the book in the Old Testament. So some people see the book as having two separate or three separate authors, so three different Isaiahs or two different Isaiahs. We have, so there's this big block of Isaiah material in 2 Nephi that everybody's aware of, but in 1 Nephi we get two full chapters, and they're taken from the second half of the book of Isaiah, chapters 48 and 49. And in 2 Nephi we get chapters 50 and 51. And then in Abinadi's material, we get 52 and 53. And then in 3 Nephi, when Jesus comes to the Nephites, we get 54. So we have a lot of the early chapters of Isaiah are discussed in 2 Nephi. A lot of the later chapters of Isaiah, up through 54, or maybe 55, are discussed in other parts of the Book of Mormon. What we don't have is what's called 3 Nephi's material. So we don't have the last 10 chapters or so in the Book of Mormon that are found in the Old Testament, and so they're not quoted from, they're not used. And maybe I'm forgetting my numbers at this point, but 1 Nephi again runs from about the second chapter through the 39th chapter, and then second Isaiah is from about chapter 40 to, I believe, chapter 55. And how many chapters are in the book? I think it's about 10 more than that. Okay, so I think it runs through about chapter 66 or 65 or 66. I'm not remembering now. But anyway, we typically talk about just one Isaiah. But I wanted you to know that the material that comes in chapter 20 can be seen and has been seen as coming from the second Isaiah, the material that's dedicated to the second half of the book of Isaiah, which is important because it's the first half of Isaiah is dedicated to thematically. Thematically, it's dedicated to mostly Assyria, Israel's relationship to Assyria, and that would be, of course, the northern tribes, the northern tribe Israel, in its relationship to Assyria, and the judgments of God upon Israel. And it's the second half of the material that's about redemption, that's about Israel's relationship to Babylon. And so these chapters come from that section of the book of Isaiah. Remember, Nephi said, I'm going to give you these things that you might have hope, or that we might liken them to ourselves, and we can from these things derive hope. So the hopeful chapters of Isaiah are 40 to 55, or beyond. 40 and all the other chapters tend to be more hopeful in nature. It's the early chapters that we associate with condemnation and judgment and punishments upon Israel. And so Nephi correctly says these chapters are about hope. And now I did say in the previous video, there are three things I want us to keep in mind as we look at Isaiah's writings. One is he's using Isaiah's writings that he might help his brethren, in this case, to more fully be persuaded of the Lord their Redeemer. And it was taught earlier, and I mentioned this in the last video, that Isaiah speaks much about the restoration of the house of Israel, especially the Jewish people. But he also does talk about the house of Lehi. And thirdly, his message is one of hope and redemption. It's about the fulfillment of the covenant, that God would fulfill his covenants made to Abraham. And it's a message of hope, and it's a message of gladness and joy and thanksgiving and so forth. And anyway, with that as a backdrop, so that's the structure of the book of Isaiah. Those are some of the themes that we've already encountered as Nephi has begun to introduce the material to us. And now what is going on in chapter 20 of 1 Nephi? This is interesting. Now, there are different takes on this. I'll just give you my reading of it. I have been told that some people view this as condemnation to some degree of Israel. Others say no, it's God. God is calling his people into covenant in this chapter. Of course, the chapter heading talks about the fulfillment of prophecy, that this chapter is about God fulfilling prophecy. So there's any number of ideas about the chapter. Now, I wanted just to remind you too, historically speaking, that Isaiah wrote in a time before the Babylonian captivity. So when he discusses Babylon in this chapter, he's discussing Babylon, but it's future to him. It's because Israel isn't taken captive by Babylon until much later than Isaiah, much later than Isaiah. And so when Isaiah is talking about Babylon and flee from Babylon and Babylon will be destroyed, it can be understood in that historical context, of course, but it also has a modern day or latter day application, which is the more interesting application for me because I'm a modern reader. But there is a historical level to this, and Babylon is again removed in time from Isaiah, and the Babylonians come in like 586, 87 to destroy Jerusalem and to carry many people captive. And it's that Jerusalem that Lehi flees from before it's taken captive by Babylon. Anyway, so the Nephites just escaped that Babylonian captivity. Now, there's a lot here about the Lord seems to be calling upon his people. And he says this, "Hearken and hear this, O house of Jacob, who are called by the name of Israel and are come forth out of the waters of Judah." And then Joseph Smith adds this phrase, or out of the waters of baptism. He added that in 1840 in the second edition of the Book of Mormon. Now, this idea of coming out of the waters of Judah, some have understood that to mean from the womb, out of the waters that have to do with the womb of the women of Israel. And then Joseph adds this idea, or out of the waters of baptism. And baptism, of course, is associated with the birth process, too. There are scriptures in the Pearl of Great Price that associate baptism with water, blood, and spirit. And so it's all very consistent here. But that was added later. That was a detail added later, which is rare in the Book of Mormon. Now, this first part's about the apostasy of Israel, because it says they swear by the name of the Lord and make mention of the God of Israel, yet they swear not in truth nor in righteousness. So they're professing religion, they're carrying on, with the appearance and the form of religion and godliness, but they're not actually religious or godly. They're actually hypocrites. They're hypocritical, and they're not keeping. They're speaking one thing and doing another. It says in verse 2, nevertheless, they call themselves of the holy city. And now remember, the last chapter we talked about the Jews and those that lived in the land of Jerusalem and how they would, some of those things relative to them. And so he says they call themselves of Jerusalem, the holy city, but they do not stay themselves upon the God of Israel. And that name was used in the previous chapter. Who is the Lord of hosts? Yea, the Lord of hosts is his name. So they don't stay themselves. They're not anchored to him. They just call themselves of the holy city. So it's again, they're in a state of apostasy, a state of wickedness, and that's why ultimately they are taken captive and destroyed by Babylon. Now, verse 3, behold, this is the Lord speaking through Isaiah. I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth, and I did show them suddenly. Now, he says this again in verse 5, that I have declared certain things from the beginning, and they have come to pass, and when they came to pass, they did come to pass suddenly. So whenever I see the word declared, I have declared these things, I'm thinking of the prophets, okay? So in our previous material, remember, there was much about the prophets. We talked about Nahum, Enoch, Moses, the prophet. We talked about all these prophets, and so Nephi is very much steeped in this idea of he searches the prophets. He loves the prophets. And Isaiah here is saying that I've declared things to you, Israel, from the beginning. And I declared them, and I showed them as I declared them, and my words came to pass. I did show them, and when they came to pass, they did come to pass suddenly. Okay? And he repeats himself in verse 5. Now, he says here in verse 5, I have even from the beginning declared to thee by my prophets, before it came to pass, before any of these things came to pass, I showed them thee, or I made them manifest to you through the prophets. And I showed them for fear lest thou shouldst say, mine idol did them. In other words, my gods did them, not the God of the prophets. So he forestalled that. He sent the prophets beforehand, declaring these things, that when they came to pass, the Israel might know that it was God that brought them to pass, and not the idols of the pagan nations that they had adopted. In their when they inherited the promised land, they began to adopt different gods and idols and so forth, and get into idolatry. And God is saying, that's why I sent the prophets initially, so that all this could be established beforehand. Now, verse 6 is very interesting to me, and I'll give you just a couple, 6 and 7 I want to read carefully here. Thou hast seen and heard all this, the fulfillment of all these words of the prophets, and will ye not declare them? Will you not testify of this? Will you not bear witness of this, that I have done these things, Israel? And that I have showed thee new things from this time. In other words, I brought forth new things, new to you, okay, from this time and not from the beginning, even hidden things, things that were hidden, and thou didst not know them, apparently. They are created now and not from the beginning. And then it says this is this is an ironic twist here. It says, even before the day when thou heardest them not, they were declared unto thee. Lest thou shouldest say, behold, I knew them. So I think what he's saying here is, I declared these things to you, but you did not understand them. And yet when I bring them to pass, they feel like they're coming forth newly. So they're new things, hidden things, created now and not from the beginning. But all along I had declared these things, and I had made these things known. You just didn't comprehend. Okay, you were in a benighted state, and you didn't comprehend my plans and my purposes on earth. and in the plan of salvation and how it's going to be laid out. And so you think these things are new and unprecedented and unanticipated, but they weren't. They're according to my plan, okay? And because of your wickedness, and by the way, when Isaiah was called, and Isaiah is called, the call story for Isaiah is in chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah. Some think that chapter 40 is also a call story for Isaiah, and therefore, the book's broken into two parts. The first calling is chapter 6. The second calling, for some people, seems to be Isaiah chapter 40, a new beginning to the book. Anyway, I just want to remind you, when Isaiah was called, it said that his commission was this from the Lord. He said, "Go, tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not. And see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat. Make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and are converted, and are healed." In other words, Isaiah, you're going to speak to a people that aren't going to understand you. And you're going to declare things to them, but they're not going to comprehend them. And if they did comprehend them and understand them in their hearts, they would be healed and converted and healed. But they won't. Many of them, most of them, will not understand, and they will reject you. Isaiah was, by the way, martyred, traditionally martyred. He was sawn asunder. And that's discussed in the Bible dictionary a bit. Now, the thing is, Isaiah was to speak many things that were important for his day, but his people were, the northern kingdom was taken away by Assyria, and then eventually after his day, the Babylonians come in and again take captive the inhabitants of Jerusalem and some of the surrounding villages and areas. The thing is, Isaiah foretold all of this, but Israel was in a state of decline, and so these things, he says, I have declared them, but you didn't comprehend them. I declared them from the beginning, and you didn't comprehend them. Therefore, these things seem new, and they were hidden to your eyes, and they were hidden to your understandings. But they seem like they're created now, but they're not created now. They were declared from the beginning. So there seems to be a paradox that's kind of unpacked here, or at least suggested here in verses 6 and 7. Verse 8 says, "Yea, and thou heardest not, Israel, you heard me not. I declared these things, but you heard me not. And thou knewest not, yea, from that time, the time of your apostasy and your decline, thine ear was not opened. For I knew that thou wouldest deal very treacherously, and wast called a transgressor from the womb." Remember, the womb was referred to in the first verse, that you're of the waters of Judah, the womb of the woman, right? The birthplace, from the waters of creation, or the waters of baptism, which is like unto the womb. Says here, yeah, "For I knew that thou wouldst deal treacherously, and wast called a transgressor from the womb." Okay, so the Lord foreknew that Israel would apostatize. In fact, Moses had indicated that, listen, here's the law, here's the covenant, but if you break the covenant, you're going to be scattered to the nations. He told them that in Deuteronomy, way back in Deuteronomy. And by the way, this chapter has been compared to Deuteronomy because it's establishing the new covenant. It's establishing a new covenant with Israel. In some sense, he's inviting them to hear and hearken to him. And so just like in Deuteronomy, Moses is establishing a covenant with Israel before they enter the promised land. Here, Isaiah is saying, hearken and hear, this is the covenant, and you've apostatized, but remember this. This is verse 9. There's a transition at verse 9. He says, "Nevertheless," this is the transition word here, "nevertheless, for my name's sake will I defer mine anger, that I will not cut thee off entirely and forever." Israel, you're going to be scattered to the nation, but I'm not going to destroy you utterly. Instead, here's my plan. "For behold, I have refined thee and chosen thee in the furnace of affliction." You're going to spend some time in the furnace of affliction, many centuries. And we talked about, that in recent chapters. "For mine own sake." In other words, it's according to my plans. "Yea, for mine own sake will I do this, for I will not suffer my name to be given to another people, but I have chosen you." This is because of the fathers. Remember the faithfulness of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because of the faithfulness of the fathers, the children will not be let go. And in a future day, in a latter day, God intends to restore the Jews and restore the house of Israel and give them a new covenant, okay? And by the way, the new covenant will be a new thing, and it'll be a hidden thing, and it will seem like it's created now, but it has been declared from the beginning. Okay, so that goes back to verses 6 language. The Book of Mormon came forth suddenly. It came forth as a new thing. It came forth, it was hidden in the earth, and it came forth from the earth, and it was seemingly created out of nothing, created immediately. It came forth in like 65 working days, or just 70, 75 days. I forget the exact number. It came forth very suddenly. And the thing is, the Lord's turned everything upside down, and now he's gathering Israel. And the covenant made to the Gentiles is being fulfilled, and Israel's now being extended a new covenant, and a new covenant, much like the covenant Moses made with Israel in Deuteronomy, is being established again. But a higher, holier covenant, one that has to do with the Melchizedek priesthood in the fullness of the gospel. But what's interesting is the Lord says, "I will defer mine anger." In other words, I'll let you suffer among the nations here. And then he says, verse 12, "Hearken unto me, Jacob, Israel, my called, those that I've called before the world. I called you. You are foreordained, and you were of the house of Israel, and you were elected to receive the gospel as children to the fathers who have been so faithful. For I am he," okay? "I am the first. I am he that was at the first, and I am he who will be there at the last." In other words, in the latter days, it'll be me as well. So I was there at the beginning, from creation, and I will be there at the end to gather my people. So he says, I am the first. I'm with Israel from the beginning, and I will be with them at the last. And he is. He's with us today, and he's helping us in this work, or he's directing this work to gather the children according to the promises made to the fathers, because of their faith and because of, again, his great love for the house of Israel. Now, this idea that I am the first and the last is just repeated in more extended terms in verses 13 and 14. He says, "Mine hand also hath laid the foundations of the earth." That's still, I am at the first, it's kind of a creation image. "And my right hand hath spanned the heavens," okay? "And I called unto the heavens, and they stand up together." In other words, I am full of power, and I am he that created the earth and called forth the firmament and said, "Appear," and it appeared, okay? So basically, I am the first. I am he that is the creator. I am he that gathered the stars together and caused them to appear in the night sky, in the firmament. And then verse 14, he says, "I am also the last." He says this, "All ye, house of Israel, assemble yourselves." That means gather yourselves and hear me now, because I'm going to speak a new covenant to you. "Who among you hath declared these things unto I have loved?" In other words, the prophets. "Yea, and he will fulfill his word." He, God, will fulfill his word, the prophet's word, which he hath declared by them, the prophets, which has been declared by the prophets. So the prophetic word, the prophecies will be fulfilled, okay? And he says, "Assemble yourselves and hear me, because I'm going to speak again," okay? You've been scattered. Yes, you were in a state of apostasy and you've been scattered, but hear me. I'm going to assemble you again. And the prophets who've prophesied of this event, I have loved them, and their words will yet come to pass. They will come to pass. I will show them. I will show them suddenly. It will be like a new thing to you, a hidden thing, a thing that's created now, but it's not created now. It was declared from the beginning by the prophets, and I've loved the prophets, he says. "And I will do my pleasure on Babylon." So this again, Babylon was, in this part of the book of Isaiah, we get a lot about Cyrus, the Persian, who overthrew the Babylonian Empire and things. And so when he says, "I will do my pleasure on Babylon," he means I'll bring the Persians against Babylon, and I will destroy Babylon. But in our day, he means I will destroy spiritual Babylon. When I gather my people, I will come to destroy the wicked of the earth, the spiritual Babylon, or Idumea, as section 1 calls them. In other words, the wicked of the world. I will come to destroy the wicked, and I will gather and save and preserve my people. Okay, much of this will be discussed later in this block of material. Now, he says in verse 15, also saith the Lord, I the Lord, I have spoken. These next few verses are about Jesus Christ, I take it. They're messianic in nature, okay? So 15 through 17. But there's this one interesting moment, and I'm going to make this radical proposal. Verse 17 seems to be, there are two servants that seem to be discussed here. So verse 15 says, also saith the Lord, I the Lord, yea, I have spoken, yea, I have called him to declare, meaning the Messiah. I have called him to declare, and he declared his messiahship. He taught his gospel, and he's this first servant. He is the prophet, capital T, the prophet, okay? And then in verse 17 it says, and thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. And these two names were used in the last chapter. Remember, Nephi was going to use Isaiah's words to help us appreciate the Redeemer, our Savior and Redeemer, and he had been called the Holy One of Israel in the former chapter, and that name's important, and it will be important in 2 Nephi and Jacob's teachings. Okay, and thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, I have sent him. Now I'm proposing this is a second servant, okay, I have sent him. So we already know the prophet's been sent, and this is the Messiah who would come. But it says here, thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, the Holy One, I have sent him, meaning a second servant, a lesser servant, but an Elias for the other. Remember, like John prepared the way for Jesus. This is another hymn, it seems. The Lord thy God, who teacheth thee to prophet, is the prophet that's addressed the rest of the passage here. So I'm proposing there are two servants being discussed here. One is the prophet, the Messiah. The other is another that has been sent in a day when God will, it'll be in a latter day when God will assemble the people and ask them to hear him, or command them to hear him and assemble themselves, because he intends to save them and destroy Babylon. Okay, that's what I'm proposing. Now, verses 18 and 19, some people say, the Book of Mormon, well, it contains the fullness of the gospel, and they say, in what sense does it contain the fullness of the gospel? And we talk about different ways it may contain the fullness of the gospel, and I'm not satisfied with any of them, frankly. But verse 18 is just a great example of how this book contains the fullness of the gospel. I already said this book teaches eternal marriage. And how do I know that? Well, because look at verses 18 and 19. This language, this imagery, if Israel had been faithful, they might have had, it says here, oh, that you would hearken to the commandments, Israel. Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. Thy seed also had been as the sand, the offspring of thy boughs like the gravel thereof. His name should not have been cut off. In other words, these are the Abrahamic blessings. You would have had the Abrahamic blessings. You didn't keep the commandments, though, so you lost the Abrahamic blessings associated with eternal marriage. And the thing is, these things are to be restored in a latter day, because again, the Lord says, I am at the first, and I will be at the last, and I will call servants. And I command you to hear me and to hearken to their words, because they will all the prophecies will come to pass that have been declared by the prophets. So the Abrahamic covenant seems to be alluded to in verses 18 and 19, and all Israel had departed from the Abrahamic blessings, and they needed to be restored in a latter day. And so here's the exhortation by the end of the chapter. Go ye forth, latter day Israel, from spiritual Babylon. Flee from the Chaldeans, okay? With a voice of singing. In other words, you've been converted. You've come unto Christ. With a voice of singing, declare ye what ye have found. Tell it to the ends of the earth. Go and share this with the ends of the earth. Say ye, the Lord hath redeemed again Jacob, the house of Israel, and he's established Zion on the earth. Go and tell this to all the earth. You are now converted to this. You have received the fullness of the gospel again, and I have established my new covenant with the earth. I have restored new things, hidden things, created now, but they were declared from the beginning. And now you know this. You've heard and understood. Now you can be converted and be healed. And now you have an obligation to share these things with the ends of the earth. And it says here, verse 21, and they thirsted not. Now it's referring back to Israel's story in the wilderness. They thirsted not and so forth, and I clave the rock, and the waters came forth and refreshed Israel. And just like that, so have I done that again. And verse 22 says, and now, notwithstanding, God hath done all these things formerly, and he will do greater things yet to come in the last dispensation of time. There is no peace. I told you this. I come with judgment. When I come again, there will be judgment. There is no peace unto the wicked, saith God. And so when I come again, I'm going to preserve my people and destroy the wicked. There is no peace for the wicked. But he does say, I have done great things for Israel before. I performed many miracles for them in the wilderness. And I will do greater things for Israel in the last days. I will do even greater things for them in the days before my coming. And that's how I read that. I hope I haven't gone over too much, but I'll stop there so as not to lose the ability to transmit this or upload this to Facebook. Thanks.